Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the 14th episode of the Startup Boston podcast, where I interview entrepreneurs, investors, and influencers in the Boston startup community to uncover actionable advice and stories from their experiences. I'm your host, Nick Dupuis. Today, I sit down with Vanu Bose, founder and CEO of Vanu. Vanu attended MIT, and in between his undergrad and graduate work, spent 2 years working at a nonprofit, which brought him to over 30 countries around the world. After MIT, Vanu started a company based off of his PhD work, which was around the idea of software upgrades instead of hardware upgrades to update cellular network standards, say from 3G to 4G, potentially saving the wireless industry billions of dollars. Their technology is being used in places like Vermont, India, and Rwanda, where they are currently working to provide coverage to 1 million people who previously had no wireless coverage. Currently, there is over 1 billion people in the world who don't have voice coverage. Vanu is looking to change that. In this episode, some of the things Vanu shares are how they were able to infiltrate a market with 4 major incumbent suppliers, how they're able to profitably run a wireless base station in what was previously an unprofitable location, why they chose Rwanda to prove the feasibility of their technology, and the biggest lessons he learned from his father, the founder of Bose Corporation. Also, this week in the book giveaway, I'm giving away The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen. This book is based off the idea that great companies can fail because they do everything right. Clayton proves this with stories and explains how to avoid it. Clayton talks about disruptive innovation and the set of rules to capitalize on it. Since this is a podcast focused on startups, I really think that this book can be helpful to not only founders, but employees at startups as well. To enter into the giveaway, make sure you subscribe and leave a review of the podcast on iTunes. If you've already done this, then you're already entered. Also, by subscribing, you'll get all my new episodes right on your podcast app as soon as they're released. Enjoy today's episode. Vanu, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks, Nick. Happy to be here.
Before we start, can you give us a little information about your background?
So, born and raised in Massachusetts, went to MIT, did my undergrad and graduate work, took a little break between undergrad and grad school and worked for a nonprofit for 2 years, which took me to 30 different countries and places that you'd never normally go, like El Salvador, Nicaragua, China at the time. It was pretty cool. And then, it's not too exciting after that. I basically rolled my PhD thesis into a company and have been doing that ever since.
So tell us more about your company then.
So the company was founded based on our technology for software radio. The fundamental premise was, every time a carrier rolls out a new standard, like 2G to 3G to 4G, they have to deploy new hardware at all their cell towers before they can start offering a new service. And this can be tens of billions of dollars of hardware, for example, with LTE to upgrade the network. So our thought was pretty simple. What if you could take everything that made one standard different from another up into software? Then you could do software upgrades rather than replace all the hardware wholesale. I mean, the state of the wireless industry is sort of like in your computer world, if every time you wanted to upgrade Word, you had to buy a new laptop, right? And so we wanted to decouple those. And, that's a hard, challenging problem. And when we did it at MIT, the underlying resources, the processors, the RF components, they weren't mature enough. Slowly, they've matured enough so that you can do a lot, still not everything, completely in software. Some of the limitations today are the power amplifiers and the high power filters and antennas. Everything else is pretty flexible, which is pretty cool.
And where can people find your technology being used?
So, like most companies who start out with a technology, you have to figure out what the business application is. What problem are you solving for people? And where we've evolved over time, I'll save you the trouble of all the different things we tried that sort of worked or didn't work. But we're in an industry where there's a very small number of large incumbent players in the wireless infrastructure industry. You know them all. Ericsson, Nokia, and 2 big Chinese vendors are really about it. They're all multi-tens of billions of dollar companies. So the question is, how does a small company break into such an industry? It's not like, you're creating a new industry, a new marketplace. You're trying to compete in an existing one. And our marketing and business philosophy, we really revamped it after the economic crash from 2008 to 2010. We almost went out of business. Our customers stopped buying. And it's one of those things where if you survive it and figure it out, then it was a good thing. Mm-hmm. And it really caused us to rethink our strategy. And we based our strategy around the theories of Clay Christensen, a Harvard Business School professor. He wrote originally The Innovator's Dilemma. He was the one who coined the term disruptive technology. And we were very, very fortunate to have him on our board at the time. And, Clay talks a lot about disruption and how do small companies sort of gain market share and ultimately compete and topple over the big companies. And one of the key things in terms of finding a place to start with your technology is looking for what Clay calls non-consumption. There's a group of potential customers who don't use the product or service. Maybe it's too expensive, maybe they don't have the resources, maybe they don't have the know-how or the market access. And if you can figure out how to address them with your technology, you'll open up a new market that the others can't address. You'll own that, and then you can use that to build into other market spaces and ultimately compete with the big guys. So it took us a while to determine what is non-consumption in the wireless infrastructure industry. And the definition we arrived at was actually anywhere that you don't have good coverage. Because every carrier wants to take out the magic marker and color in the whole map. And the only reason they don't is that current technology doesn't make it cost effective to provide coverage in places such as inside of skyscrapers, in rural areas, especially in rural areas of developing markets, on ships, in tunnels, etc. So that became the market we focused on. One of the first things we did was create a novel in-building system for the Indian market, which has particularly challenging in-building coverage problems. And we deployed, over 2,000 of them with Indian carriers last year. Really reduces the cost of both deploying and supporting in-building coverage. But as we looked out at all the possible market segments of non-consumption, there was one that was vastly larger than anything else. And that was the rural developing market. So rural areas in India, in Africa, Southeast Asia, some Latin America. Depending on whose estimates you believe, there's between 1 and 3 billion people that don't have coverage. Realistically, it's probably 1 billion people who don't have voice coverage and over 3 billion who don't have internet access at all. And that's a pretty big market. So we looked at that, and the basic problem with the market is the following. In a rural area, you have lower population density, and in rural developing markets, people can afford to spend very little on their monthly phone bill. So, for example, in rural Africa or India, people might spend $1 or $2 a month on their cell phone bill, and that's what they can afford. So when you combine the low population with the low, what's called ARPU in the business, average revenue per user, your revenue per cell site goes down. But then to make matters worse, in these rural developing markets, the cost of running the network's actually higher because most of these places are off-grid. There's no electrical grid. So you have to run the cell sites on diesel. And cell sites typically take between 2 and 4 kilowatts of power. Now you can spend, depending on which country and the tariffs, up to $4,000 a month just on your diesel fuel, while your customers are paying you $1 or $2 a month, right? Mm-hmm. It's not going to pencil. In addition, diesel is a huge theft item in these areas because fuel's precious, so you have to have 24/7 security guards, which increases cost. And it's an environmental disaster. In fact, there was a great study published in Reuters some years ago that showed in rural Africa, you actually burn more diesel bringing the diesel to the remote rural site than you do at the site. So for every gallon you burn, it's like more than 2x the actual environmental impact. And then Technology Review, I think it was last year, had an article and showed that actually now 1% of the world's energy is consumed by cellular base stations. So it's a significant challenge, in both environmentally and from a cost perspective. So basically the reason you don't have coverage in rural is a very economically rational reason. If the carriers built sites in the traditional way, they would lose money. Yeah. And so they don't build. So we actually then sat down and said, well, we have to figure out a way to change that equation. And what we've come up with is a combination of technology and business innovation that has three aspects that together give us 10x better economics in rural. So the first is we had to get off diesel, right? There's no way that you can make this pencil if you're on diesel fuel. Now, the problem is in a typical cell site taking a few kilowatts of power, that's really cost and practically prohibitive to build solar fields or whatever other alternative form of energy you might use. So we took a different approach. Rather than trying to figure out an alternative energy source to power these sites, we said we need to reduce the power consumption of the site. So we created a base station. First was GSM. We have GSM CDMA and now coming out with GSM LTE that consumes 50 watts of power total, 50. So it's like a dim light bulb. At that level, you can actually run it off solar. Now, one of the other challenges in energy consumption in rural is that you have to use energy to cool equipment and batteries and things like that. So we designed the whole system to run without cooling up to 55 degrees C, which is about 132 degrees Fahrenheit. So we got rid of all the cooling energy as well. Now, the first problem we faced was nobody believed that you could actually run a solar network just on cellular network, just on solar and battery without a diesel backup. And nobody believed you could run it in places like sub-Saharan Africa without cooling. So we actually did 2 trial sites in Zambia for an entire year, ran on just in solar and battery and through the entire Zambian summer, which did hit 55 degrees in the internal temperature on 3 days. So we proved that the technology piece would work. But the key was, then we thought, okay, we went to the carriers and said, well, now you can get rid of your energy costs. But while that helped and maybe the sites could be marginally profitable, when you look at the carrier economics, they're still going to get a better return on investment by investing in more data capacity in the urban areas than marginally profitable rural areas. So we had to go further. So the next thing we did was we looked at it and said, well, it really is hard in rural if every carrier has to build their own network and get a return on that network. In urban, it works because you got a lot more revenue, but in rural, it's really challenging. So we came up with something we call the wholesale carrier model. And we actually deployed this first in Vermont, rural Vermont. The idea was that we'll build one network that's shareable between multiple carriers. So then in these rural areas where they don't have coverage, you can have multiple subscriber bases amortizing the cost of one network. And so we did this first in Vermont, and it had to support both GSM and CDMA, and we're going to be doing an LTE upgrade soon. But we have 9 carriers, both US and Canadian, because it's on the border, using the network. So there's parts of 9 subscriber bases amortizing the cost of one network. So that gives you a much better ROI on the network. But then the third and final piece, we realized, I give credit to our one of our board members, Barry West, who was the CTO of Sprint Nextel. And he said to me, I've built lots of rural sites at Sprint and Nextel, and the traditional thinking is in a low population area, you want to build the tallest, highest power site you can to cover the most area. But he said to me, mostly you just cover rocks and trees, and they don't generate enough revenue. So that got us thinking. We said, all right, what if we built a network that covered where people live, work, and commute? Because if you have coverage in those 3 aspects of your life, you're pretty happy. And we looked at this, and now we looked at this in Vermont, Alaska, Rwanda, Ghana, Zambia, and now India. And I think this is a universal truth. What we've learned is that well over 90% of the homes and businesses are within 2 kilometers of some road. Not a highway, might be a dirt road, but everybody needs access. And we said, well, if we cover those roads and 2 kilometers on either side, and that, of course, covers the towns and villages, you're going to get all the places people live, work, and commute. And so then the light went off and said, wait a minute, if we're just trying to go a radius of 2 kilometers, I don't need these big, tall cells. I can cover rural with small cells. And that becomes a lot cheaper. You don't need big reinforced towers. You don't need as much land, etc. So that's what we're doing in Rwanda right now. We're in the process of building what will be 376 sites, all 10-meter poles, which will cover a total of 1 million people, all solar powered. So the entire site for the microwave radio, the cellular base station, the charging, consumes 90 watts of power. We provision it with 120 watts of solar and enough battery to go more than 24 hours if there's no sun. And the idea is that ultimately we'll support all three of the carriers in Rwanda in areas where none of them have coverage today, making it profitable even for these low ARPU areas for them because of our model. So that's a long-winded way to tell you about where we are today.
You brought up a lot of points that I want to talk about.
Excellent.
So we'll start with Rwanda first. Why the focus on Rwanda, the rural areas in Rwanda versus other countries?
So we were looking for a place in Africa to prototype the model. And I talked to a lot of people. And the advice we got was if you want to do something sort of as a prototype, to show the feasibility, go to Rwanda first because, as I was told, things worked in Rwanda. Best advice I ever got. And the government is fantastic. If you go to Kenya, it could take you 3 to 6 months to incorporate and set up a business. It was done in less than a week in Rwanda.
Wow.
Yeah, fabulous. They have really nice tax incentives for setting up new businesses. Rwanda, I think a lot of people here, the last thing they know about Rwanda was probably Hotel Rwanda. What they've done in 20 years is absolutely miraculous. Kigali is the cleanest, safest capital city I've visited in Africa.
Wow.
It's an unbelievable place. It's growing. The government has a huge emphasis on education and ICT connectivity. That's how they see, bringing the population and the business opportunities forward. So they're very supportive of this effort. We couldn't have had better support from the government. It's easy to do business. It's a safe place to do business. So it was a great choice. And I thank all the people who pointed me at Rwanda because I didn't know that much about it. And the idea is we're going to prove the economics of the network in Rwanda with these 376 sites. That will be enough to have a validated economic model that we can expand in other African countries. We've already started looking at some, Tanzania, Sierra Leone, Ghana, among them. But ultimately, our goal is to, with this model that makes developing market rural coverage profitable, our goal is to cover those billion people who don't have coverage today.
So those 376 sites that you're bringing on to cover 1 million people at a cost of $10 million, is that right?
That's correct. So it's $10 per pop covered.
So how does that cost compare to providing 1 million people in an urban area?
Well, urban will be obviously more efficient in general. What our cost is much better than if you take the urban approach with the big cells and put them in rural. That doesn't work. A typical cell site in rural costs $200,000. That's your typical number in Africa. Installed, including land purchase and everything, we're under 20,000. So there's a big difference.
Yeah.
So this is it's an approach that's very tailored to the rural marketplace. It's not, a high capacity urban type system.
What are some of the challenges that countries face when introducing a wireless infrastructure?
I would say in general, there haven't been barriers. The adoption of cellular has been incredible in places like Africa and India. And it's really solved a problem. Like, these countries didn't have good landline infrastructure. So, for example, India, even today, has less than 30 million landlines in the country of over 1 billion people. So think about it. Before cellular, 30 million out of 1.1 at that time billion people had a telephone. Now it's like, I think it's 700 or 800 million have phones. And that's because it's actually much more cost effective to build cellular infrastructure than run wires to everyone's house. So there's been very little barrier once, I think there was a perception, especially in Africa at first, that, well, cellular wouldn't work, there's not enough money, but MTN really proved that wrong, and others, in terms of groundbreaking and showing that there's really pent-up demand. I think what's hard for people in America and the West in general to understand is that we're not, we think of cellular as bringing mobility to people. There, you're bringing the telephone. So in a sense, people are existing in a pre-Alexander Graham Bell world. And so you're going from pre-Alexander Graham Bell to telephone, mobile phone, and social media all in one step. Mm-hmm. And it's radical.
So I think some people might be thinking that people in these developing rural countries might have larger problems than cellular coverage. So can you explain to them the importance that cellular coverage brings in these areas with a huge quality of life?
Great question. So a lot of initiatives require connectivity. So, for example, a lot of the health initiatives in rural that are hampered because health workers can't communicate when they're in the rural areas. Mm-hmm. So one thing I just learned, and the reason we're actually looking at Sierra Leone as one of our next countries, I was told that there's no connectivity in the rural areas of Sierra Leone. And when the Ebola outbreak happened, it existed for 2 to 3 months before people in the capital knew about it, because there was no communication network to get the information back, and people were dying or moving away into other rural areas, and it wasn't known. So connectivity, it underlies healthcare, it underlies education. There's a company called Off-Grid Electric that we're talking to who's in Tanzania and now Rwanda. So they actually go in and put in solar systems on homes, LED light bulbs, and even LED televisions. And their business model, they install that, and then the people using mobile money pay for so many hours of power. But to do that, they have to have cellular connectivity to the box, right? And so they can't build in the areas that don't have connectivity. Right. So, we're hopefully that now that we're building these areas, now they can bring solar to those areas. So I've come to believe that communication is one of the fundamental underlying infrastructures to enable so many initiatives and capabilities that you want to bring to rural.
Another like a data point that I came across was that GSMA had a study that shows for every 10% increase in rural connectivity, GDP goes up 1.2%.
Yeah. And that was a study done in Indian villages, and I quote that a lot, actually. It's a great study. And what I tell people is that there is absolutely nothing we can do in the United States to raise our GDP by 1.2%. Yeah. And you can do it 1.2 for every 10% increase in penetration. Yeah. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's a huge increase.
But it tells you how much connectivity underlies economic activity. And without it, it's just stunted.
So how does your technology compare with any other existing technology for rural?
So what we've focused on is, the extremely low power, extremely low size, so you don't need a big structure or pad to mount it, and very high temperature range. Those are the areas that we differentiate. Those systems aren't necessarily the highest capacity or highest bandwidth systems like you would want in urban, but that's because they're designed for this billion-person rural market instead.
So I want to talk briefly about your business model, where the operators pay for the time used rather than for the cost of the equipment. So is this driven by wanting to lower the barrier to entry for the operators, or is it more to set yourself up as well for the long-term growth and rural connectivity?
It has both, but your former point is why it started. It's that when you look at the operator's CapEx budget, it is more rational for them to build more populated areas and higher data capacity in the urban areas. That's where they get the best return. So, it doesn't make sense to go ask them to allocate capital budget to rural. So what we said is if we can figure out a way to make rural profitable by working not just with one operator, but by multiple, then, and the whole point here, I want to back up and make an important point, is that people often think, hey, you're working rural, that's great. It's a social enterprise or a charity, and it's not that. I don't believe this problem of 1 billion people is suitable to be solved by a charity or subsidies or anything like that. And the reason, one, it's really big, but two, these kind of things require ongoing support, maintenance, and upgrade. And that's not a thing charity's good at. Charity's good at getting even large chunks of money sort of one time to solve a problem. But, if it's going to require $100 million annually to keep the network going and upgrade it, that doesn't work. So our whole goal is we have to find a way by reducing the costs to make it profitable to do rural. And then once it's profitable, you can build business. Now, the difference is that the profitability in rural, even with our model, might not give you the same ROI that carriers have covering urban areas. So what we will be looking for once we get over this initial phase of proving it is probably looking at social capital investment type of investments where it is a monetary for-profit investment, but with a social impact. And the trade-off is for that social impact, you might be getting a you might be getting a 7-year ROI rather than a 4-year ROI that you'd get by investing in a carrier in an urban area. But we have to be careful to make sure we have investors who are willing to take the longer ROI in return for the social benefit, which will allow us to build the networks and keep them profitable.
And it's much lower risk for them because they're only paying when people on their network are using that
for the carriers
tower.
Exactly right. So we ask them for nothing up front. And if their subscribers never use our network, they never pay anything.
Right.
So it's only basically what we're asking them effectively to do is share the piece of revenue they get. So they'll take a piece, we'll take a piece. So we've really tried to make it seamless and zero risk for the carriers to do this. And we're only trying to build where none of the carriers have coverage. That's our sweet spot. Mm-hmm. If one or two have coverage, it doesn't make sense.
Can you talk a little bit more about some of the other solutions that Vanu provides?
Yeah, so I mentioned the in-building stuff, and what we're doing in Rwanda and Vermont, we call our coverage as a service business. We have another unique product line for which actually addresses the problem of the use of illegal cell phones in prisons. Mm-hmm. 3 or 4 years ago, I was unaware of this problem. And I got a call from someone who was at the FCC who described to me that this is a real, a big safety problem. So people, who are incarcerated get a hold of phones. They continue to run their criminal enterprises. They do witness intimidation calls from behind bars. A guy in Texas arranges escape on a cell phone. And probably the worst and highest profile case was the director of Colorado prisons was executed on a hit called in from a guy behind bars. So it's a real safety issue for the staff. It's a real issue in terms of, you might remove these people from the community, but they're still running their criminal enterprise in the community. Yeah. And he said, hey, I'd like you guys to think about this. I think with your technology, you might be able to solve it. And so we did. And what our systems do is it has 3 requirements. We have to be able to sort of attract and hold all the illegal cell phones in a prison. We have what's called a whitelist. So if the staff has phones and all those phones have to be able to work normally. And the third requirement is my favorite, which is that we have to be able to complete 911 calls for all phones, including the illegal phones behind prisons. Now, you might ask, what's the scenario where you're already in prison and call 911? Apparently, that doesn't really matter. It's a liability issue. But we do all 3 of those, and we signed an exclusive distribution agreement last year with a firm called Securus Wireless, who supplies a lot of telecom to prison. And that was the right way to go about the market for us because we don't have any presence or not. We have the technology, but no market presence or market knowledge. They have all the contacts and all the systems. And we just got sign off of our first working system in a facility with them last week. So we're very excited about the future there and the ability to make the environment safer for those working in and around the prisons. We've also come across, I guess it shouldn't be surprising that internationally there's the same problem. So there may be even a bigger market for that.
So what does the future look like for Vanu? What solutions do you want to provide and where do you want to expand to next?
So there's 2 pieces. We really are excited about the coverage as a service business. We really want to, there's a lot of people have talked about connecting the next billion. Now, we're starting with 1 million, but if we can do the 1 million, we can do the whole billion. And that's our main goal. The secondary goal is going back to the beginning, as I mentioned, the underlying technologies, the RF CMOS, the processors, the ADD converters, have advanced to the point that we can now build some of the systems we envisioned 10 years ago, 15 years ago even. And so reinvigorating the R&D on that to build more dynamic, flexible systems is really our long-term future.
Mm-hmm. For the software upgrades instead of the hardware upgrades?
Yeah, that would be one thing. But also, there's a lot of talk about what's called dynamic spectrum access. So rather than just licensing fixed channels to individual people, you could be much more efficient in use of the spectrum if you could dynamically access spectrum when you needed it and sort of give it up when you're not using it and someone else can use it. rather than, well, I'm not using it. Cellular networks are mostly dead in the middle of the night, and that's dead spectrum, and there might be other uses. Or even during the day, rush hour is busy here but not there, and you could fill in with other uses, other capabilities. So that's really what the software radio enables, is dynamic spectrum access, and that's the long-term future.
What would some of the other uses for that spectrum be?
Well, so a big, wide use is this whole area called the Internet of Things. You got lots of heterogeneous devices with usage patterns that aren't like cellular devices. Water meters that may spit out a few bytes a day, and tracking devices and things like this. So you all of a sudden have all these devices which want sporadic communication, maybe small little bits of communication, not contiguous coverage, not 100 megabits bandwidth. And if you can dynamically use spectrum and they're not very latency sensitive either. So that's a really great application of dynamic spectrum.
What have been some of the biggest lessons that you've learned running your own company?
Oh man, where to start? Well, I think one of the best lessons, and I learned this. I learned this from my dad, but then I kind of had to relearn it myself, is that you're probably onto something if everybody else thinks you're crazy, right? You're either onto something or you're doing something crazy. It's up to you to figure that out. But if you're doing something that kind of everybody agrees with and everybody else is doing, you're not doing something innovative. You're doing something obvious. So you have to have a tough skin when people are saying you're crazy and it won't work and this is not how we build these kind of networks. That's the only way you're going to get through and do something really different.
Is there anything that you would do differently if you were to start over again?
Lots of things. I mean, I made a lot of mistakes on the way. We probably grew at the wrong time, raised money at the wrong time, tried hiring the wrong people too early or too late. But it's all a learning experience. And I don't think that when you say, what would you do differently? It's not formulaic. It's more, how do you react to the different situations that come up and understand it? And I think I think the exciting thing is it's this constantly learning process. You're constantly learning new things and applying them and doing better. So as long as every time we're better at doing whatever activity was, developing a new product, opening a new market than we were before, we're going in the right direction.
I want to talk a little bit about your father. I feel like it wouldn't be right to have this podcast and not talk a little bit about him.
Sure.
So Dr. Vanu Bose, founder of Bose Corporation. So how has your father inspired you in any way?
Oh, I mean, the biggest was just being around him and watching him do what he did. And a lot of his research was done at the kitchen table, especially when I got old enough and went to MIT and I could start understanding the math. Would talk to him about it. But I'll tell you one of the single most sort of, I guess, inspiring lessons I learned was something where he wasn't even trying to teach me a lesson. But it was really about innovation, where we were driving home one day in a driving rainstorm. And, once your windshield wipers get old, they kind of take a set and they smear on the windshield.
Yeah.
And then there's only the spot down the bottom that's clear. So my dad drove home like hunched over, peering out this one clear spot. And as we're pulling in the garage, he says to me, there really ought to be a better way to design a windshield wiper. So, I'm walking in the house. I thought, somebody who really knows about windshield wipers and mechanical engineering ought to think about that. There's got to be a better way. That's not what my dad was thinking. And 2 weeks later, I remember walking by his desk in his study, and I noticed there was a patent application for a brand new windshield wiper design. And the lesson I got from that, and also from the way he taught his course at MIT, is that, look, if you have a good background in math and system theory, the domain doesn't matter. You can go into it and break it down and understand it and be creative in that domain. It doesn't matter, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, acoustics, all the governing equations are basically the same. And so you really shouldn't be afraid to look at areas that you might traditionally say, oh, that's outside my domain. And and in fact, there's been some papers written that show that a lot of big breakthroughs in a field actually happen from someone outside that field because they bring a new perspective. So I think it's important not to be afraid to look outside your domain.
It seems like your father devoted a lot of his success to his curiosity and always wanting to learn about new things. Yeah.
Yeah. Whether it's windshield wiper or, the fact that he was on a Swiss Air flight who was the first airline to introduce electronic headphones, and he was really disappointed in the quality because of the background noise. And it was on that flight he started designing the noise-canceling headphones. Mm-hmm. Always curious about how can this be done better or different.
So he donated a majority of the Bose Corp stock to MIT. Can you talk about what the driver and goal behind that decision was?
Well, it fulfilled two very important goals. One, the way that it's structured, it allows Bose Corporation to stay private, which is very important to my dad because he always invested in long-term research. The wave radio was a 12-year research project before it came out, and the basic technology in there is still far and away better than anything else on the market. Noise-canceling headphones were a business unit that ran for 10 years without making money, but he knew that there was real potential there, and he kept at it. And he felt that in the public markets today, you can't have that long-term view. There's too much focus on quarterly and annual earnings. So in order to remain innovative, he wanted to make sure the company stayed private, which this gift enabled. And the other was, and he's stated many times that he would not have been what he was or able to do what he did if it wasn't for MIT, and in particular 3 people, mentors, teachers of his, Norbert Wiener, Professor Lee, and Jerry Wiesner, who was later president of MIT. So this was his way of saying thank you to them.
I want to move now into our rapid-fire questions, not necessarily rapid-fire answers.
Okay.
So the first question is, what's another startup in Boston that you're most excited about?
Oh, so my favorite is Transatomic Power, Leslie Dewan. Mm-hmm. You're nodding your head.
Yeah, I know of them, yeah.
And I love this because what I really like, and I think has the biggest potential impact, although it's long-term and requires a lot of investment, is sort of science-based innovation. For me, I'm not interested in building the next app or the next social media site. Yeah. But if you can really innovate, science-based innovation is where the big game-changing breakthroughs come through, whether it's the transistor, the integrated circuit. And I think what Leslie's doing in terms of, who would have imagined you could have a nuclear power startup? Yeah. But that's what they're doing. It's awesome.
It is fascinating. What's something about you that most people don't know?
Man. You told me this question in advance and I couldn't think of anything. I think I'm kind of an open book. That I am what I am. I like my sports. I like walking the dog, and there's nothing too fancy.
What are some of your favorite tools that make your life and work easier?
Well, the smartphone and the laptop have been liberating, right? I can go to Africa and I'm as productive in my hotel room as I am in my office here. The world, the connectivity is just amazing. But a few years ago, I felt that I wasn't doing a good enough job getting a hold and managing all the different things as a company grows. And I read a bunch of books. The classic Getting Things Done was really kind of inspirational for me, and I adopted a lot of those techniques. And there were several other books I read as well. And so integrating, I would consider them tools, even though they're more techniques or processes. And honestly, I think it really is kind of old school, but this right here, the good old notebook. Carry it everywhere you do. I write down everything, both business and personal. It's all in one place. I can refer to it. That's my most useful tool. I hate to admit it. I got my smartphone, my laptop, but somehow writing on those things isn't the same. You can't do diagrams. You can't quickly scratch stuff. That's my most useful tool. And going through the books like Getting Things Done and what was the other one? The Magical Art of Tidying Up really sort of confirmed that for me. That it's still the best medium we know.
Yeah. So but beyond those 2 books you just mentioned, what are some of your other favorite books?
So let's see. What have I read recently? So one of the things, as I told you a couple of years ago, I was kind of focused on making myself more efficient. Recently, I'm really focused on health for improving efficiency, effectiveness, creative thinking. I realize like there's sort of this, it's a joke, but not really among undergrads at MIT, the sleep is for the weak. And, now I realize how stupid that is because, your productivity declines so much without the right nutrition and the right sleep. So one of the big changes for me was reading Dr. Mark Hyman's book, The 10-Day Detox Diet. It's 10 days, it's pretty harsh, no caffeine, no alcohol, almost no carbs, no dairy, no gluten. In 10 days, I lost 9 pounds and my cholesterol went down 100 points.
Wow.
Yeah. So that kind of opened my eyes, like, wow, you can make a big difference in a short amount of time. And recently I've been more focused. I just read a book called Sleep Smarter. And it's particularly relevant for me because I do so much international travel with India and Africa. I don't think I have a natural time zone or body clock anymore. And, I can just see my productivity declining when I don't have better sleep. Now, the problem is all these books are great, and I think their techniques work if you're just staying in one time zone. I haven't yet run into anything that helps you as I was in London for 3 days. I was back for 2 days. I was in Africa for 2 weeks. My clock's all messed up, and I haven't found a good solution for that yet, but I keep reading.
Arianna Huffington just wrote a book too about sleep.
I just downloaded it on my Kindle. I haven't opened it yet.
Yeah, I've heard it's good.
Yeah, good. I can't wait.
What advice would you give to your 25-year-old self?
Stop worrying so much. Don't worry about the outcome or what's going to happen. Just work hard. I mean, one piece of advice my dad gave me, which, again, I'm still working on fully incorporating, he said, do what you love, work hard at it, the money will take care of itself. I think that's right. But it's really hard to remember when you're not sure how you're going to make payroll next week. Mm. So I think I spent too much time worrying, and that's not productive.
Just a few final questions here to close out. So where can people find out more about Vanu? So
on our website, www.vanu.com, our more relevant and up-to-date is our Facebook page, Vanu Inc., VANUINC. In fact, there's pictures up there of our sites in Rwanda as they come up, and as you'll see on those pictures, whenever we build a site, it's a community event. We hire local people in the community to dig the holes and build the site. And there's a crowd of like 30 or 40 kids around the site all day. It's just fascinating. So there's a lot of cool stuff there. And that's the best way to keep up.
Where can people connect with you online?
On Twitter, Vanu.Bose or Vanu Inc.
And last question here. Do you have any parting thoughts, advice, or suggestions for the audience?
Well, I mean, if you're listening to this podcast, I assume you're interested in innovation and entrepreneurship. And I would say, if you want to do something, just do it. Don't worry too much about. I think a lot of people worry about having all the pieces in place first. I want to get this experience, that experience. I got to have a business plan that's refined, and you can kind of refine that forever. At some point, you just got to jump in and go.
Vanu, thank you for coming on the show. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, Nick. It was a lot of fun.
Don't forget to enter this week's book giveaway, The Innovator's Dilemma, by subscribing and writing a review on iTunes. By subscribing, you'll get all my new episodes automatically fresh onto your podcast app. So make sure to do so, and it really helps me out in the rankings and with acquiring new listeners. Remember, all show notes can be found at startupbostonpodcast.com. And make sure to follow the podcast on Twitter at StartupBossCast. That's Startup BOS Cast. Thanks for listening, and until next time, if you have any feedback, ideas for guests, or just want to say hi, you can reach me at nick@startupbostonpodcast.com. That's NIC@startupbostonpodcast.com. Cheers.